What if we told you that even today, there are people, both powerful and ordinary, who believe Africans are not capable of governing themselves? Hard to believe, isn't it? But it's true. Some Western elites and commentators have openly said that Africa would be better off under Western control again, that recolonization might be the only way forward, and they're not hiding it. They say it in interviews, write it in columns, and push the idea in subtle ways through policy and aid. Even more disturbing? Some Africans believe it too. Years of poverty, conflict, and corruption have created a false belief that African nations are doomed to fail unless the West steps in. But is that really the truth? Or is it the result of decades, centuries of carefully crafted manipulation? Is Africa truly incapable of self-rule? Or has it been deliberately kept unstable? Recolonization is not just a dangerous idea, it's a return to chains, this time, mental ones. So before we accept this narrative, we must ask, who really benefits from an Africa that cannot stand on its own? Let's dig deeper, because this isn't just about politics. This is about power, dignity, and Africa's right to control its own future. Recently, a former U.S. Navy officer, Erik Prince, made an outrageous statement on his podcast called Off Leash. Before we talk about what he said, let's share a little background about this man. Erik Prince is a former Navy SEAL officer, the wealthy heir to an auto supply company, and most importantly, the founder of the mercenary group Blackwater. You see, Blackwater is just like Russia's Wagner Group, a private military company. But as it is with the hypocritical West, Blackwater has never been condemned or received the negative narrative that Wagner has received since its formation. Meanwhile, these two companies basically do the same thing, which is to provide security for payment. The way the Russian government uses the Wagner Group is almost identical to how the US government has used Blackwater and other American private military companies. Blackwater was contracted numerous times by the US military to carry out missions that advanced US foreign policy, most notably in Iraq. The company gained international notoriety in 2007 after one of its operations ended in the massacre of 17 unarmed civilians, including 2 children. Although the employees involved were initially convicted, they were later pardoned when Donald Trump took office. Imagine that. Now, the 2007 massacre is just one of the few missions by Blackwater that became public. But there's little doubt that the company has conducted many other covert operations, missions that have destabilized entire regions and led to the deaths of thousands. Now, this same man, who operates like a shadow advisor to President Trump, is currently helping him broker a deal with the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. If you recall, the DRC's president recently offered the country's vast mineral resources to the US in exchange for assistance in tackling insecurity. With Erik Prince now involved, there's growing speculation that Trump may plan to deploy Blackwater to solve the crisis. But we all know how that usually ends. However, that's not the main focus of today's video. What we're really here to talk about is the outrageous statement recently made by Erik Prince, the founder of a private military group that has left a trail of destruction across the globe. During a podcast interview, Erik Prince made a jaw-dropping statement. He said, "If so many of these countries around the world are incapable of governing themselves, it's time for us to just put the imperial hat back on, to say, we're going to govern those countries. 'Cause enough is enough. We're done being invaded." You can say that about pretty much all of Africa. They're incapable of governing themselves. Shocking, right? But it gets worse. When his co-host, Mark Serrano, asked if he was seriously endorsing colonialism, Prince didn't hesitate. He responded, "Absolutely yes," and went on to say that colonization is a great concept for both Africa and Latin America. First of all, the fact that Erik Prince could say this on a public podcast without any fear of backlash tells us 2 things. 1, this isn't the first time he's made such a statement, and 2, many in the West, especially those in positions of power, likely agree with him. According to Prince, the West should recolonize Africa because Africans are supposedly incapable of governing themselves. He points to post-independence African leaders who, in his view, have failed to lift their nations out of poverty and hunger and into real development and industrialization. And here's the uncomfortable part. To some extent, Erik Prince is tapping into a truth that even many Africans acknowledge. Governance is one of Africa's biggest challenges. Since independence, many of the leaders who have taken charge of African nations have done so not to serve their people, but to serve themselves and their Western backers. These so-called leaders have looted national coffers, siphoning off billions meant for hospitals, schools, roads, and clean water. Instead of building, they plunder. They twist and bend their nation's constitutions to cling to power. They rig elections, silence opposition, and impose themselves on citizens through fear, manipulation, and propaganda. While the masses suffer in poverty, these men live in obscene luxury, flying private jets, buying foreign mansions, and throwing lavish parties funded by public money. Let's call them what they really are, not leaders, but thieves in suits, whose only goal is to steal as much as they can before their time is up. And the worst part? Some rewrite the rules again and again just to stay in power for life. There's no denying that the West bears significant responsibility for Africa's current condition. But we must also face the hard truth. African leaders themselves are a major part of the problem. Decades of selfish, visionless leadership have left the continent underdeveloped. Millions of people across Africa still struggle just to survive, without access to basic needs, let alone opportunities for growth. In desperation, many have begun to migrate, risking everything to reach what they believe is a better life in the West, especially in Europe. But over there, this movement isn't seen as a humanitarian crisis. It's seen as an invasion. To many in the West, Africans and Latin Americans are not people seeking dignity. They're treated like pests. They're portrayed as threats, bringing crime, disease, and poverty, breathing their air, taking their jobs. This is exactly why immigration has become one of the most hotly debated policies in Europe and the West today. And make no mistake, those policies are becoming harsher by the day, especially for migrants from Africa and Latin America. Take the United States, for example. Under Donald Trump, deportations have ramped up, especially targeting non-white migrants. But just weeks ago, he welcomed white South African migrants with open arms. What does that tell you? This isn't just about immigration, it's about race, a quiet cleansing, right before our eyes. Now, let's circle back to Erik Prince. For Prince, simply tightening borders isn't enough. In his view, Africans will keep invading the West unless something drastic is done. His solution? Recolonize Africa. Help develop it. Because according to him, African leaders are too corrupt and incompetent to do it themselves. To make his argument sound less brutal, he added a layer of fake sympathy. If you go to these countries and see how they suffer under absolutely corrupt governments that are just criminal syndicates, a lot of them deserve better. On the surface, it sounds like compassion, but don't be fooled. That's just a mask, a convenient cover-up for a dangerous idea dressed up as charity. But here's the disturbing part. Erik Prince's logic, as twisted as it is, sounds convincing to some. In fact, there are Africans who now echo his beliefs. Beaten down by decades of poverty, corruption, and hopelessness, some have begun to say the unthinkable. Maybe recolonization wouldn't be so bad. We've heard it. We've seen the comments. There are those who say, at least if the West comes back, we'll get good roads, proper hospitals, and a working economy. Some even point to South Africa as an example, claiming that it's more developed than the rest of Africa because of its long history under white rule. One Nigerian, responding to Erik Prince's call for recolonization, said, if the US takes over, at least we'll have constant electricity. The Naira will be scrapped for the dollar. Life will be better. Another wrote that he'd welcome recolonization with open arms, because in his words, our leaders have done nothing but steal. It's heartbreaking that things have become so dire, so unbearable, that some Africans have begun to internalize the belief that they are incapable of ruling themselves, that the only way forward is backward. But is that really the solution? Or is it the final stage of mental colonization, the belief that freedom is too heavy a burden for the African to carry? The fact that some Africans have begun to accept the idea of recolonization reveals just how deeply colonialism has scarred the continent, not just physically, but mentally. The damage isn't just in stolen resources or broken systems, it's in the mind. You see, the mindset Erik Prince carries is the very same mindset that launched colonization in the first place. It always starts the same way. We're doing it for their good. That's what they said when they invaded. That's what they said when they enslaved. That's what they said when they drew borders across lands they didn't understand. And that's what Erik Prince is saying now, pretending it's about helping Africans, when in truth, it's about power, profit, and control. As one sharp critic put it, Erik Prince didn't call for recolonizing Africa out of concern for Africans. No, he did it because he knows exactly what's at stake: untapped resources, geopolitical advantage, and above all, the billions of dollars he and his network could make if such a plan were to be put in motion. He's not hiding it either. To speak so openly, so boldly, without any fear of consequences, what does that tell you? It suggests one terrifying possibility, that he's not alone, that somewhere in high places, there are others who share his vision, quietly, strategically, waiting. As for those Africans who now believe that recolonization is the answer, it seems they've forgotten their history, forgotten the blood, the sacrifice, and the struggle that led to independence. Because if colonization had truly been a golden era, if everything had been rosy and sweet, then why did our forefathers rise up to demand freedom? Why did they risk their lives for self-governance? The bitter truth is this: the very people some are now calling on to save Africa are the same ones who broke it in the first place. Let's not forget the transatlantic slave trade, the centuries of human trafficking that ripped millions from their homes, shattered families, and robbed Africa of generations of builders, thinkers, and leaders. Let's not forget colonization, which not only exploited African labor and resources, but also deliberately stunted the continent's growth, economically, politically, and socially. Yes, the colonial masters built roads, hospitals, schools, and ports, but not for Africans. These structures were placed strategically to extract resources and consolidate power. They were never designed to serve the people. They were built to serve empire. For example, roads, ports, and bridges were built to transport raw materials gotten from the colonies to Europe. They never thought of building factories in Africa to process the raw materials, because that would mean industrialization would begin in Africa. Rather, the goods are processed in their countries and the finished products are sent back to Africa to buy. This model is what has continued even till today. The economic model proposed by the so-called World Bank, which is actually a Western bank, continues to push this model. They advise African countries to open their doors to Western companies to attract foreign investment. In reality, these companies are simply there to access cheap raw materials and transport them to the West, where they will be processed. What about education and the so-called civilization they brought? Schools in Africa were built to indoctrinate and civilize Africans in the ways of the West. They taught Africans useless knowledge that has no benefit. They never transferred technology to Africans. Till today, the African education system is still the old, outdated system of education with no practical knowledge. During the colonial era, those who lived in the best streets and beat areas were not Africans, but Europeans. In South Africa, you can clearly see that disparity and inequality till today. The majority of the private land belongs to the white minority. So, what makes those Africans who believe that Africa will be better off being recolonized think that it will be any different now? Actually, it will be worse off now if it eventually happens. In a world where, despite the efforts put in place to eradicate racism is still very much alive, a fact that Black Americans in the US can testify to. There are people among the leadership of the West and even Western citizens who still hate the black man and regard the black man as an animal. So what would happen if people like that get the chance to rule African countries? It will be the worst thing to ever happen to Africa. Now, Erik Prince and his proponents may say that Africa only has leaders who loot and enrich themselves at the expense of the masses. But what about all the leaders in Africa who attempted to change things? What happened to them? They are all dead, assassinated by the West. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, Muammar Gaddafi, and MK Abiola. Today, we have Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, and in just 2 years, he has experienced 18 assassination and coup attempts. The fact is, the West does not push good governance in Africa. Whenever there is a leader who attempts to do something different, he is quickly eliminated because the West knows that if Africa becomes stable and developed, the continent will assume power, and they don't want that. If this is not the case, why is it that all Western interventions, whether in the form of military or economic, always leave the African country worse off than before their intervention? Take the case of African independence, for example. When African countries gained their independence, most of them were not financially or economically stable because the colonial powers had taken everything with them. Some countries, particularly in Francophone Africa, were even left in debt, not because they had borrowed money, but because they were required to pay for the so-called benefits they had received during the colonial era. Imagine that. Under the guise of helping African countries, the IMF and the World Bank introduced the Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, which offered debt relief in exchange for economic reforms aimed at making these economies more capitalistic and liberalized. However, nearly all research on the SAP shows that its implementation left African countries deeper in debt, triggered inflation spikes, and resulted in the overall failure of many national economies. Today, African countries are still struggling to solve the effect of the SAP, and the reason why the program failed was that it was never their intention to help Africa. The SAP meant that the Bretton Woods institutions had control of African exports, which consisted mainly of raw materials and commodity products, and since they had control, they could easily influence the price, reducing the amount they paid for the product and at the same time increasing their own exports into Africa. And so, profits were exported to the West, and economic growth was crippled through limited local investment. This is the reality of Africa. Some people may point out how far China and even India have come, but the fact is, you cannot compare Africa and China. The whole system has been rigged against the African continent from the beginning and is compounded by the fact that its leaders are weak-minded people who cannot stand for their people. However, there is hope. New leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré and Julius Malema are emerging who have chosen to say no to the ideas and interference of the West. Hopefully, these leaders will live long enough to change the reality of things. But before that happens, Africans need to undergo a decolonization process, especially in their minds. Some Africans, even African leaders, still suffer from an inferiority complex. They think that the West is better than them. Just look at how the South African president was behaving like a little kid before President Trump last week. It was absolutely pathetic. This is why President Traoré advocated for a necessity for Africans to decolonize their mind. Colonization was the worst thing that could have happened to the African continent. We can only imagine what the continent would have looked like if it had been allowed to progress on its own. Perhaps kingdoms like Ashanti, Ethiopia, and Buganda might have blossomed into modern constitutional monarchies or republics. Earlier economic and political federations, reminiscent of the Mali Empire, could have taken shape without arbitrary borders. Similar tribes might have merged on their own to form one country instead of what we have today. West Africa's textile centers, such as Kano, and East Africa's complex trade networks might have sparked localized industrial growth. Africa would not have had to depend on the West for their needs. Trade would have blossomed within Africa. The possibilities are endless, but the West stole that from Africa. Nevertheless, we can only look forward. And looking forward doesn't mean recolonization. Looking forward simply means developing strong leaders and strong institutions. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.